Just when you thought it was safe to watch videos again on the internet comes Tales from Someplace Besides the Garage.
Hey folks, this is my first video in quite a while, in-person video anyway. I've done a couple music ones. Wanted to do this in the garage in the worst way, but pretty much since Halloween came at the end of October, it's been winter temperatures here. Like in the 20s and 30s, much colder than it typically is this time of year. So we got no real autumn. So as a result, it's freezing out there. So kind of forced inside. And, well, that's life. And I got all my Halloween stuff still set up in the garage. So I would have really liked to have done a video there, but it's just too cold. Haven't really had a subject or reason so much for doing a video. Yeah, I've got dribs and drabs, new albums in, but just not things to talk about so much, you know. Just one thing here and there by this artist, another thing, and couldn't really make a cohesive video out of it. But my buddy Carm did a video very recently, last week or two, on the German record label Mood Records. And he's curious as to what people out there had in terms of mood stuff. Now, Mood Records, interesting label, a label that when I started picking stuff up from the label, I didn't even realize how small of a label it really was. Totally and completely based in Germany. It really wasn't, you know, they started putting stuff out, it was founded in 1977, and they started putting out LPs right away. Founded not by record company executives, but rather by three German jazz musicians, fairly well-known German jazz musicians. So for once, the control of the record company was actually run by three musicians, guitarist Volker Kriegel, who has since passed away, Wolfgang Downer, a pianist who's still around, and Albert Mangelsdorf, the trombone player, very well known also, who has passed away in actually 2005. Unfortunately, the label folded, kind of gave up the ghost back sometime in the early 2000s or so. Up until that point, they weren't necessarily issuing new albums. They were doing some repackagings of older albums. A couple of those I have here. But they had a small, very select group of musicians. Naturally, the guys that founded it were the guys that put out albums, Volker Kriegel and Wolfgang Downer especially. But all three members that founded the record label, including Albert Mangelsdorf, all played in a large band called the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. Now, I first heard about the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. I read about them in the late 70s. They had put out several albums, and you couldn't get them here in the United States. I actually knew several record store owners, and they couldn't even order them. That's how impossible they were to get. So I don't think it was really until the CD era came around that these albums started managing to kind of get released as imports over here. Probably easier once the internet hit, and you could, you know, go online and find places that did imports. It got quite a bit easier then. But initially, in the late 70s, early 80s, you couldn't get these records in this country, and I tried. When I found out about the existence of the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble, because it had a couple of my favorite musicians in there, namely Eberhard Weber, the bassist, was one of the founding members, and Charlie Mariano, who's my favorite saxophone player in the world, who played in Eberhard Weber's band, was also one of the founding members of the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. and along with guys that became favorites of mine, guys that I didn't know at the time, like keyboardist Wolfgang Downer and Volker Kriegel. By the way, Volker Kriegel's got a Facebook page that I believe is run by his daughter, and it's a shame that he didn't live to see the whole Facebook thing and, you know, see how people appreciate his work. And he was also a cartoonist, and he actually earned a living as a cartoonist, which is evident when you look at some of the cartoon covers of his albums that were actually drawn by him. Very cute characterizations. So Carm mentioned that he was curious as to what Mood Records albums people had out there, and it's hard to tell going online, but it looks like I said, the record label started in '77, and their first release was actually one by the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. It's hard to tell. It looks like they put out in their lifetime, you know, maybe 200 releases or so. That's a rough estimate. So maybe that's why I didn't know that. I was expecting it was more than that. Maybe that's why in all the years I haven't really come across many more than the ones that I'm showing you. So one of them that I have that I kind of picked up at random. I actually picked up in a group of imports, and it was totally unknown to me, was this one by the Sagmeister Trio, which is just a guitar, bass, and drums trio. I actually talked about this in the video a year or more ago, because I had pulled this out after not listening to this for years. I had no idea who Sagmeister was. I think it's Michael Sagmeister, I think is his first name. Of course, it doesn't say on here. Yeah, Michael Sagmeister is the guitarist, and it's essentially his group and his writing. Just very much modern jazz. I'd say the album that it sounds the most like to me is Pat Metheny's Bright-Sized Life, which was Pat Metheny's very first solo album, done around 1976. And this is done right around that same, yeah, this is 78. So it very much has that Bright-Sized Life Pat Metheny sound, which Bright-Sized Life was also just a guitar, bass, and drums trio. This is before the Pat Metheny group and all that kind of stuff. I prefer this over Bright-Sized Life, but it's in that same mode. Originals, very clean kind of sounding electric jazz guitar, very nice. But I had not known of this musician, and it just so happened that I got this in with a bunch of other CDs that I bought. So all of the other albums I have, let me do it this way. All of the other albums I have are pretty much by musicians associated with each other, one way or the other. I'm not going to talk about each one of these. I don't have all of the United Jazz and Rock Ensembles, but I do have most of them and all the early ones. This is the first release on the Mood label, sorry for the glare, was United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. I'm just about to drop about a dozen CDs here. And they recorded a whole lot. There's probably more United Jazz and Rock Ensemble albums that came out on Mood record labels probably than any other musician. I think Wolfgang Downer did record a bunch himself. Just a whole bunch of these. Most, not all of these are live albums, because they're essentially, write music for the ensemble at hand. So even when they did go in the studio, I don't think they really did any overdubbing in the studio. But Eberhard Weber was a founding member. Let me see. I want to say John Heisman was the drummer. I have to do this from memory because you can't read any of this stuff on the back here. Barbara Thompson, saxophone player. Albert Mangelsdorf, the trombone player. Ian Carr was also in the group at one point. I think he was a founding member. On trumpet, Charlie Mariano, of course. That's my most loved ones. Of course, are the ones with Eberhard Weber and Charlie Mariano. They recorded a whole bunch. I think I have all the ones that actually Eberhard Weber and Charlie Mariano play on. Wolfgang Downer plays on all of them, and Volker Kriegel plays on most of them. I think he only stopped recording with them when he passed away, and they did continue on after that point. Volker Kriegel was a guitarist, a jazz guitarist that I've come to love very much and really appreciate. Here's later on. I don't necessarily know that they were recording any more new albums, but they repackaged some of these. So here's a repackaging done later of 2 of the albums. And here's a compilation best of that they put out, just taken from their other albums. And then here's an interesting later edition thing that they did. They put together, this is a 2-album set. But instead of just re-releasing 2 existing albums, they did compilations of one album that took tracks from all their different albums that were all composed by Wolfgang Downer, and then another one where they just took from various albums again, all compositions by guitarist Volker Kriegel, and they kind of compiled them onto their own. So it's basically the works of Wolfgang Downer and the works of Volker Kriegel as played by the United Jazz and Rock Ensemble. So that interesting compilations. One of my favorite Charlie Mariano albums happens to be on Mood Records. And he didn't actually record a lot either for them. Plum Island. Freddie Studer, the drummer from Ohm. Jasper Van Hoff, who, the European, I don't know what nationality he is actually. I want to say maybe Dutch. Wonderful keyboard player. I'd love to hear a solo keyboard album by him. He supported Charlie Mariano and a whole lot of jazz musicians throughout the years. And he's probably better known for supporting a lot of musicians like Archie Shepp and Charlie Mariano and being in their bands. But he also did stuff on his own. And Nicola Fisman, who's the bass player here, who, so it's basically bass, drums, and keyboards supporting Charlie Mariano on saxophones and flutes. I love this album. This is from the early 80s, I want to say. Yeah, 85. January 1985. So it's just basically a quartet, and there's one kind of rockish guitar solo that actually works on one song that's uncredited. And I'm like, well, how come they didn't credit the guitar player? And I just had the slightest feeling that it might be the bass player, Nicola Fisman, who I found on the internet somewhere quite a handful of years ago. And I happened to send him an email, and he replied, said, yeah, I'm the guy that played the guitar solo on that track. I'm like, oh, okay. I don't know why they didn't credit him. But I figured if they had brought in an outside musician that they would have credited him. So on the album, Nicola Fisman is just credited with playing bass, but he does play a guitar solo on one of the tracks. Continuing on, in Charlie Mariano mode, Charlie did record a bunch with Wolfgang Downer, so we get Wolfgang Downer in here, who's one of the founders of the label, and Dino Saluzzi, who plays the bandoneon, which is kind of, sounds like an accordion. It's like a different version of an accordion. An interesting oddball trio because there's no bass and no drums. They recorded a couple albums together, including a live album. Again, this is from, I want to say the early 80s. Yeah, I can't. The printing is so small, and it's a little dark in here. One of my favorite albums from all time, it turns out, is on Mood Records. Tagore, Meditation on the Landscape, which is essentially kind of like a soundtrack album. The music was written for, I guess a documentary on Tagore. But it's incredible music, and it's unlike a lot of soundtrack music that a lot of soundtrack albums will have these tracks that are a minute long and a minute and a half long because it's just the music the way that it was used in the movies. This isn't that case at all. You know, there's a few tracks that are under 4 minutes maybe, but then there's much longer tracks. Listening to it, you would not know that it's a soundtrack album. And it's just Wolfgang on piano and synthesizers, and Charlie Mariano on alto sax and flute, and Ernst Stroher on percussion. Just 3 guys. And they don't all play on each track. There's a couple tracks that are, I think, just Wolfgang solo, a whole bunch of tracks that are just duets with Charlie Mariano and Wolfgang Downer, and then a few tracks that also have the percussion, mostly hand percussion in there. It's just a great album. This is one of those albums that took me a long time to appreciate, maybe because it's very low key, and it's easy to kind of drift off to and daydream to, and then it's over and you don't realize that maybe you weren't paying attention or something. It took me quite a few years to really appreciate how good this album is, and it's become one of my favorites, and it's a shame that it's on a label that now is, you know, defunct, so the recording is out of print. Great album. Probably if I could only save one Moods Records, it probably would be that one. I hesitate to shudder. I shudder at the thought of that, though. Here's Mr. Mangelsdorf and Wolfgang Downer, just as a duet, a piano and trombone, kind of an odd combination, but very interesting. Wolfgang Downer solo piano, which a couple people have shown recently. Chris Kibler has shown this as an LP, as has Carm. Excellent solo piano disc. Again, I think this is... it's hard to tell. Pretty much all these recordings I'm showing are from somewhere from 77, 78 until the mid-80s, which seems to be the most active period of the record label. This one is from September 78. This is Wolfgang Downer, another solo album, Changes. This one is piano and synthesizers. Very early synthesizers, monophonic. When you hear it, it's maybe a little bit dated sounding, but I absolutely love this recording all the same. But you could clearly tell it's not recorded even in the 1980s. The synthesizer sounds are fairly primitive. But I love it. I love that album. And again, later on, they did repackagings. And on this 2-disc set, they did a repackaging of the Changes album that I just showed. And I think it's pronounced Zietlauf, which is a really nice, which is the album that I basically bought this for, because you couldn't get it as an individual album anymore. Just another Wolfgang Downer solo album, wonderful album. There's no credits on there, but there's some recording playing, like the flute kind of recorder, that I think was played by Wolfgang Downer, but there's no musician credits at all on here. And if it is Wolfgang playing it, it's the only album I'm aware of that he played any kind of wind instrument. But it's a really wonderful album. I don't, regret having to shell out for 2 discs, even though I only really needed the 1 disc in here. To get that Zietlauf album as an individual. I don't even know if it ever came out as a CD. It, came out as a vinyl LP. Don't know if it ever came out as a CD on its own until they did this repackaging. Which is really one of my favorite albums by him, happens to be the Zietlauf thing. I'm going to keep this video under 90 minutes, I promise. Moving on to one of the guys who founded the label, Volker Kriegel. Some solo albums by him, again done in, this is from 81. One called Journal. It's probably my favorite album of these that I'm about to show that I have of him. There's many Volker Kriegel albums I'm missing. Palazzo Blue, which is adorned, this is a quartet by Volker Kriegel that features one of Volker's own cartoons, so you get a flavor of his. I love his cartoon characters' art. In a way, it's like something you could have maybe seen in Mad Magazine back in the day. And like I said, he actually made a living as a cartoonist for years. Here's another one I'm not even going to try to pronounce. Schon Aussichten. Don't even know what that means. Don't need to. It's instrumental. Another good album. All different musicians supporting him. I think the musicianship varies track to track, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there's like 3 or 4 different drummers on here. Different keyboard players, percussionists, bass players, saxophone players. Quite a few of his albums are like that. They're not necessarily set bands. They're just different people supporting him on different things. Now, actually, most of these albums of his that I'm showing, actually, I think all of them, yeah, the 3 that I just shown, have just oddly enough recently been re-released. So I don't know who got the rights to them, because Mood Records, most of their catalog is up in the air and are unavailable. But recently, and I say in the last year, The Volker Kriegel stuff has been reissued with bonus tracks. I haven't picked them up yet, but the bonus tracks actually, and the whole albums are actually on YouTube. And I've got them in my wish list because the bonus tracks are absolutely awesome. And so I don't know how they got the rights to them, even though the rights are pretty much, maybe because the record label was established by Volker Kriegel, it could be that his solo albums, the rights to them may have just reverted back to his family, which may also be the case with Wolfgang Downer, who's still around, since Wolfgang Downer was also one of the founders of the record label. So I'm wondering if he wanted to, if Wolfgang Downer could just re-release the albums, if he chose to, since he's still around, and he was one of the guys that started the label. Continuing on with some Wolfgang Downer material, but him playing with two guitarists, Ralph Illenberger and Martin Kolbe, who were two German guitarists who had a duo together for many years. I don't think they still get together at this stage anymore. Ralph Illenberger moved to the United States. I think Martin Kolbe still lives in Germany. But they recorded quite a few duo albums over the years, and quite a few albums, I guess, where they had some support from other musicians. In this case, Wolfgang Downer plays on here. Pretty sure Eberhard Weber plays, supporting them on a couple tracks on this. I know Eberhard Weber does play on another Mood Records Ralph Illenberger and Martin Kolbe album, where there's some input and support from Wolfgang Downer again, and also Eberhard Weber, just on a couple tracks here and there, not on the whole album. But another good album of theirs. I don't have all of their Mood stuff. And here's one called Waves. This is from, I think, 1978. Yep, and I believe that there's also a couple tracks where there's some support also, again, by Eberhard Weber and Wolfgang Downer. Yeah, they both play on this as well. So that's it. I kept it under 90 minutes. That's all I have by Mood Records. I wish I had more. But with the recent reissuings of the Volker Kriegel stuff, I'm hoping that maybe, and being that this wasn't a record label established by business executives, I'm wondering if it's possible that Wolfgang Downer, being the only founding member that's still alive of the guys that owned the record label, if they may make it possible for the musicians who recorded on the label to re-release their albums, so maybe they're not lost forever to time. Who knows? So anyway, that's my Mood Records collection. Now I have the heavy job of putting these all back into my collection, which are spread all over the place. But hope it was worthwhile watching. And hope everybody's doing well. Chat with you at some point in the future. Take care.